Julián Rivas had spent more than 30 years traveling the roads of northern Mexico, but that morning, his body could barely move. Lying in a hospital bed in Chihuahua, with broken ribs, a leg in a cast, and his soul shattered, he silently replayed the images of the accident that changed his life. He had left as usual at dawn, his old Kenworth W900 roaring down Highway 45. Lourdes, his wife, had made him coffee and empanadas wrapped in napkins, and his granddaughter Mayra had bid him farewell, with a kiss on the cheek. Everything seemed like any other day, until the brakes failed on a treacherous downhill and the truck careened hopelessly into a ravine. He didn't remember how he had survived. Only that, amid the smoke and the metal, he thought of his granddaughter and knew he couldn't give up. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. It's the only way we can keep telling them. At the hospital, the worst part wasn't the injuries, but the helplessness. He had no insurance, the truck was destroyed, and his family could barely afford the medicines with raffles, donations from neighbors, and the help of a couple of fellow truckers. Julián, who had always been everyone's support, felt like he had let them down. He saw Lourdes exhausted, selling pastries in front of the hospital. Mayra, not fully understanding, asked him why he wasn't wearing his red cap anymore, or if his old bull would ever roar again. Every night, when he closed his eyes, Julián prayed silently, even though he didn't know if anyone was listening. The sadness in his granddaughter's eyes hurt him more than any fracture. And in the midst of that bottomless pit, something happened that shook him in a way he hadn't expected. It was an ordinary afternoon, with the sky reddened by the sunset, when a young man sat next to him on the hospital bench. He wasn't wearing a uniform or ID, just a white shirt, worn jeans, and a calm expression. Julián barely noticed him at first, but the boy, without even looking at him directly, said in a calm voice, "Someone like you wasn't born to be detained." Then he stood up and left, leaving in Julián's hand a simple card with a single word printed on it: Jesus. Julián thought it was a kind gesture from a volunteer, but something in his chest shook. That night, he slept like he hadn't since the accident, with the young man's words echoing in his mind. The next day, Lourdes woke him up agitated. Outside the hospital, in front of the entrance, there was a truck parked. It wasn't just any truck, it was a gleaming Kenworth, factory fresh, with his name written on the door and the keys inside. There was no note, no signature, no witnesses, just the certainty that it was for him. Julián thought it was a mistake or a joke until he saw the card on his hospital table again. Something inside him broke. He cried silently, overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude, fear, and disbelief. He didn't understand why anyone would give him that second chance, but he knew with absolute clarity that he couldn't waste it. Julián left the hospital weeks later, still on crutches, but with a decision firmly in his heart. If life had given him back the keys to the road, he had to drive with a greater purpose. He painted the phrase, "I don't pass by," on the sides of the new truck, a silent promise to never again ignore the pain of others. His first load wasn't cement or fruit, but blankets, food, and drinking water for a community affected by a storm in Delicious. No one paid him for that trip, no one asked him to, but when he arrived and saw the tears of children receiving a carton of milk or a box of cookies, he felt that for the first time in a long time, his route had a direction. What began as a solitary act soon grew into something bigger. Other truckers, aware of what Julián was doing, began calling him. Some offered to deliver aid on their routes, others donated fuel or merchandise. Julián didn't proclaim himself a leader, but his story, told by word of mouth at bus stops, gas stations, and radio stations, became a seed. The Hope Truck, as it was now known, was beginning to be recognized on the highways, not only for its paint job, but for the unique energy it radiated. At every stop, with every delivery, Julián found someone in need, and with every gesture of help, a part of him was rebuilt. If you felt something while reading this, please subscribe to the channel. That's the only way we can continue sharing. Stories like this. One night, on a lonely stretch of road toward Jimenez, Julián saw a young man on the side of the road, staring blankly and raising his thumb. He was about to drive on as the old safety rules for truck drivers dictated, but something inside him forced him to stop. The boy, no more than 20 years old, hadn't eaten for days and was escaping an addiction that had nearly killed him. Julián didn't ask much. He offered him a sweet roll, a seat in the cab, and a silent conversation that lasted hundreds of kilometers. Days later, the young man entered a rehabilitation clinic in Durango, thanks to contacts Julián had made on his travels. He never saw him again, but months later, he received a letter that read, "Thanks for stopping. I'm alive because of that." Did this part move you? Subscribing is the easiest way to support these kinds of stories. That gesture convinced him that the truck wasn't just a means of transportation, but a tool of faith. He began organizing small operations with other drivers, delivering school supplies in rural areas, taking grandmothers to medical appointments, and even transporting stray dogs to shelters. They did it without cameras, without networks, without the press, simply out of a sincere desire to do something good. And although some mocked him, the little diesel father, they called him, Julián responded with a serene smile. He didn't have answers for everything. He only knew that if he had survived that ravine, it was because there was still a long way to go, and he couldn't do it while ignoring those suffering in the ditch. Over time, what had begun as a personal impulse became a spontaneous movement. Truckers from other states began to replicate his idea. Some painted "No paso de largo," I won't pass by, on their trucks. Others called Julián to coordinate joint deliveries. A group was created on radio frequency 19, exclusively for emergencies and aid. They called it Ruta del Bien, Route of Good. There were no statutes, no hierarchies, and no money involved. Just one motto: if you can help, do it. Julián never thought of formalizing it, but every time he opened his logbook and read the stories of those who had climbed into his truck, he felt like he was building something bigger than himself. One day, he received a call from Guatemala. It was a truck driver named Sergio who had heard his story from a Mexican colleague. He told him he also wanted to start helping on his route to El Salvador, but didn't know where to begin. Julián told him, "Start by stopping, the rest will come by itself." That phrase became a motto among the members of the Route of Good. From then on, truckers from Colombia, Peru, and Honduras began to join. They crossed borders not only with merchandise, but with a conviction that no longer fit in the trailers. What had been born in a ravine in Chihuahua now traveled throughout Latin America, in trucks that carried more than cargo. They carried compassion, but it wasn't all applause and gratitude. As the Route of Good gained notoriety, shadows also appeared. A local official accused Julián of profiting from humanitarian aid. A sensationalist media outlet insinuated that he was using the story of the accident to manipulate people. Even some colleagues began to view him with suspicion, fearing that his actions would jeopardize contracts or tarnish the name of the union. Julián never responded with aggression. He kept clippings, letters, and even threats, but he let the miles speak for themselves. His defense was every story he had helped change, every person he had regained faith in thanks to an unexpected stop. One night, while he was carrying sacks of rice for a delivery in Zacatecas, a young woman approached him holding her baby. She told him that years ago he had taken her to a shelter when she was fleeing her violent partner. Now she was a nurse, her son was healthy, and she just wanted to hold him. Julián didn't know what to say. He just hugged her in silence, his shirt soaked with sweat and his eyes full of tears. Those moments were his fuel, more than diesel. In every face rescued from despair, he found the strength to keep going, even when his body was already beginning to take its toll from years of driving. Despite his fatigue, Julián kept moving, but now he wasn't doing it alone. In his hometown, a group of young people who usually spent their time on the street, aimless and without occupation, began to approach the garage where he parked his truck. At first, they just watched from afar. Then they offered to wash the trailer, organize the boxes, and accompany him on short trips. Julián, without intending to, had founded a school. He taught them basic mechanics, took them to visit communities, and spoke to them about responsibility and dignity, not with sermons, but by example. He helped some get their first formal job. For others, he simply restored their faith in themselves. The workshop became a meeting point. People came from other cities, curious people, volunteers, students who wanted to know how an ordinary man had created a support network without resources or official permits. Julián always said the same thing: don't wait to have everything to start, just start. His words began to be written on banners, quoted in interviews, shared on social media. But he remained the same. He slept in the bed of his truck, ate from lunch boxes on the side of the road, and called Lourdes and Mayra every night to tell them who he had met that day. His life kept going, but no longer out of habit, but out of conviction. One day he received a handwritten letter from a group of teachers at a rural school in Sinaloa. They told him that, thanks to a visit he had made months earlier, the children had begun writing stories about truck drivers who helped people. One of those stories had won a state competition. Julián read the letter, sitting on the edge of an old bed in the workshop, his hands shaking. He didn't know what was more incredible, that they considered him a character in children's stories, or that those children who had once received backpacks and notebooks from his truck now wanted to be like him. Not because of the truck, but because of the gesture. That same month, he was invited to a university to give a talk. It was the first time he'd spoken in front of so many people who weren't wearing work uniforms or hiking boots. He felt out of place with his denim shirt and raspy voice. But when he began to tell how a fall forced him to look differently, the audience fell silent. He didn't use slides or elaborate phrases. He simply recounted encounters with elderly people, with women on the run, with addicts seeking redemption. In the end, the students gave him a standing ovation. Julián didn't know how to react. He never sought admiration, but he understood that if his story could ignite more solidarity, then it was worth telling. That impulse to share his experience led him to cross even more borders. He received invitations from Argentina, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. He didn't accept all of them, but he did attend some, as long as he could take his truck and bring some help on the journey. On one of these trips, he met Elena, a young journalist looking to make a documentary about the Ruta del Bien, route of good. At first, Julián was reluctant. He didn't want his work to become a spectacle, but her sincerity won him over. They traveled together for weeks, recording testimonies, carrying donations, sharing silences on endless routes. Julián, without knowing it, also began to open his own heart. The documentary premiered months later under the title Kilometers That Save. It was an unexpected success. It was shown in schools, festivals, and parishes. Julián saw himself on screen for the first time and couldn't help but cry. Not out of vanity, but because hearing himself tell the story of the young man who handed him the keys to a new truck relived that sense of purpose. From then on, his figure became even more familiar, but he kept repeating to all those who sought him out, "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who didn't want to walk on by." He said this with the same humility with which he served coffee in a dented thermos to the volunteers who accompanied him. Over time, Julián began to notice that his body wasn't responding like it used to. The nights behind the wheel weighed more heavily on him. His back pain was constant, and his vision wasn't the same. Lourdes begged him to rest, to think about himself for once. Even Mayra, now a teenager, begged him to stay home more. But Julián felt that stopping would betray everything he had built. "One day I'm going to leave, my love," he told his wife, "but let it be on the road, with dirty hands and a full heart." And she, although afraid, hugged him in silence, knowing that the man she loved didn't know how to live any other way. It was in that context that he decided to do something he'd been putting off for years: return to the scene of the accident. He took the same highway at the same time and drove alone to the curve that had nearly killed him. He stopped the truck and slowly got out. He walked to the edge of the ravine and stood there silent, breathing deeply. He wasn't looking for answers, just to close the loop. But when he turned to return to the trailer, he saw him. Sitting on a rock, like that day at the hospital, was the same young man in a white shirt. He didn't look any older nor any younger. He was just smiling. Julián wasn't surprised. He walked over and sat next to him with the serenity of someone who no longer needs to understand to believe. The young man didn't speak at first. He stared at the horizon as if waiting for something else to come with the wind. Julián didn't say anything either. The two shared that silence for several minutes until Jesus, because there was no longer any doubt it was him, handed him an envelope. Inside were donation documents for another truck, maps with marked routes, and a list of names. "It's not the end, Julián. It's the beginning of something bigger," he said in a calm voice. Julián nodded, his tears catching in his throat. He didn't ask where it all came from or why him. He only felt with overwhelming certainty that this moment was a second calling, one he must honor until his last breath. Thus was born the idea of a formal network, one that would organize the energy of hundreds of solidarity truckers who were already operating without any structure. Julián christened the project Route of Good, as it had been spontaneously called years before. This time, however, there were bylaws, coordinators, and a small team of volunteers who helped him get everything up and running. From his workshop in Chihuahua, routes were sent, deliveries were coordinated, and new members were trained. It wasn't a wealthy foundation, nor did it have large sponsorships. But each truck that joined contributed fuel, hands, and a story. Julián gradually became the heart of something that could no longer be stopped. The Route of Good grew faster than Julián imagined. Within a few months, trucks identified by a simple white decal began to appear on the borders of Guatemala, in the Mato Grosso jungle, in the highlands of Bolivia. Sometimes they transported food aid, other times they carried volunteer doctors, mobile libraries, or simply hope in the form of conversation. Each driver was free to decide how to help as long as they didn't forget the essence, to stop when others wouldn't. Julián was moved by the photos he received on WhatsApp. Children hugging boxes, elderly people receiving blankets, entire communities applauding the arrival of that trailer that came not for money, but for humanity. But growth also brought challenges. Logistical coordination, cultural differences, even misunderstandings among volunteers. There were times when Julián considered stepping aside, letting younger volunteers take the helm. But every time he thought about that, something appeared that kept him going. A letter written in crayon by an orphaned child, a call from a mother who had found her son thanks to a support network created by truckers, a thank you in an indigenous language he didn't understand, but that moved his soul. Those gestures, as simple as they were powerful, were his secret driving force. And as long as that engine kept running, he wasn't going to stop. To support the project's sustainability, Julián accepted a proposal from several collaborators to create a small operations center inside the workshop with donated computers and internet access. There, young volunteers helped record routes, document deliveries, and coordinate donations. Although Julián wasn't a techie, he learned the basics, reading emails, recording thank you videos, even sending voice messages to international groups. Every so often, he received invitations to forums or humanitarian meetings, but he always said the same thing: if I go, it has to be by driving. I don't want to stop riding. And so he did, with his aluminum mate, his old sombrero, and a worn notebook where he wrote down every person he met along the way. On one of those journeys, he met Don Ignacio, a farmer who lived on the outskirts of Saltillo and grew vegetables on a dry plot of land. Julián stopped when he saw a makeshift sign that read, "Please help." He spoke with him listened to his story and, days later, organized a shipment of tools and seeds donated by an agricultural school in Sonora. When he returned months later, he found the land teeming with life. Don Ignacio greeted him with a basket of tomatoes and tears in his eyes. "You didn't just bring tools, you brought faith." Julián kept that phrase in his notebook, underlined, not because it made him proud, but because it reminded him why he continued doing what he did. As time passed, Julián began to delegate some administrative tasks, not because he wanted to, but because his body was asking for it. Frequent headaches, high blood pressure, and a constant ringing in his right ear reminded him that years behind the wheel came at a price. Still, he refused to give up driving. "As long as my hands can hold this wheel, I'm going to keep going," he told those who tried to convince him to rest. Lourdes, always patient, only asked one thing, that he at least go to the doctor regularly. And Julián, for her sake, complied. But each doctor's appointment left a bitter taste in his mouth, not because of the diagnosis, but because he feared that one day he would be told he could no longer continue on the road. It was during one of those checkups in Monterrey that he met Martín, a 9-year-old boy undergoing treatment for aggressive leukemia. He saw him in the waiting room, drawing trucks on a crumpled sheet of paper. Julián approached him. They talked for a while, and he promised to return. With a surprise, a week later, he parked the Hope truck in front of the hospital and let Martín get in, honk the horn, and feel like he too could control his destiny. The doctors said it was the first time the boy had smiled in weeks. From that day on, Julián began visiting hospitals more frequently, bringing small gifts, stories, and above all, time. Because I understood that sometimes what heals the most isn't what you give, but staying. One afternoon, returning from a delivery in Zacatecas, Julián found a group of young people waiting for him in his workshop with a proposal. They wanted to create a little school of the road, a space where others could learn trades related to transportation, mechanics, and solidarity. The idea moved him. He had never imagined that his example would inspire something so concrete. They acquired an old warehouse, cleaned it up together, and in less than a month there were classes on oil changes, first aid, defensive driving, and even workshops on empathic listening. Julián attended all the openings, but sat in the back letting others do the talking. For him, the important thing wasn't being the face, but the inspiration. Thanks to an anonymous donation, the school was able to purchase its first truck for training. They painted it white and named it El Semilla. Each week, a different group used it to deliver something, from books to remote communities to hygiene kits for homeless women. Julián, who at first doubted whether it would work, began to see results in the stories that came in. Boys who had previously lived on the streets were now mechanics' assistants. A girl who suffered domestic violence was now coordinating aid routes. The network grew without needing applause. It was as if each generous act took root in fertile soil, and that confirmed to him that the journey had not been in vain. Stay with us. Subscribe to continue exploring these paths of hope. On one of his last long trips, heading to Tapachula, Julián shared the road with Camila, a young driver just starting out in the trade. At first, she saw him as a living legend, but she soon discovered a down-to-earth man with old-fashioned jokes and an incredible memory for town names and homemade recipes. During that ride, Julián talked to her not only about mechanics and maps, but also about the times he was afraid, the people who changed him, and how the silence of a highway can teach more than any book. Camila, who had been searching for a purpose, for some time ended up writing a chronicle that went viral, The Man Who Stopped to Change the World. That publication sparked a new wave of interest in the root of good. International media outlets wanted to interview Julián, organizations offered to fund the project, and even politicians sought to jump on the bandwagon, but he maintained his firm stance. This isn't for sale. This is for sowing. He rejected anything that might detract from the project's essence. He preferred to continue, relying on small donations and word of mouth. For many, it was madness. For him, it was the only way to keep the truck's soul intact. Because what drove that engine wasn't money or fame or recognition, it was the certainty that a willing heart can change the course of another. Upon returning from that trip, Julián spent a few days at home, more tired than usual. Lourdes noticed he was different, quieter, as if his gaze were beyond the present. One night, while the three of them were having dinner together, he, Lourdes and Mayra, he took out an old notebook and placed it on the table. It was his logbook, the one he'd been writing in since the first day after the accident. "This is everything," he told them. "If one day I don't come back, continue with this, but in your own way." Lourdes tried to hide the lump in her throat. Mayra, now 17, hugged him without saying a word. They knew this moment would come, but they didn't think it would come so soon. A few days later, Julián set out on one last short trip to Sonora. It was a simple delivery, without press or events. He wanted to do it alone, without company. Along the way, he stopped several times more than usual, to watch the sunrise, to talk to an old man on the side of the road, to help change a tire for a stranded family. It seemed as if he was saying goodbye, without saying a word. At the final stop, under a large mesquite tree near Navojoa, he parked the truck, slowly got out, and sat with his notebook on his lap. There he wrote his last words: "If you're reading this, don't forget to stop. Someone needs you." When he didn't arrive at his destination the next day or answer the radio, several fellow members of the Root of Good began searching for him. It was Camilla who found him hours later, sitting under the tree, his head reclined and his expression serene. There were no signs of pain or urgency, only absolute peace. He was wearing his usual cap, the wooden cross hanging around his neck, and his notebook open on his lap. No one cried at that moment. Camilla knelt beside him, respectfully closed his eyes, and called to the team in a firm voice, "We found him. He's at peace. Now it's our turn to move on." And so they did. The funeral was simple, just the way he would have liked it. Truck drivers from across the continent attended, along with entire communities, children with drawings, mothers with photos, and young people who simply wanted to silently thank him. Lourdes, strong as ever, read aloud a fragment of the log. Mayra, with a trembling but determined voice, promised to continue his legacy. Instead of wreaths, people brought boxes of food, blankets, books, and tools, which were later distributed along various charity routes. It was the most faithful tribute to the man who had taught us that true greatness lies in stopping for others, even if the world urges you to move on. After the funeral, the Ruta del Bien headquarters was packed like never before. Volunteers, drivers, mechanics, and even artists volunteered to continue what Julián had started. Some helped by repairing vehicles, others taught map reading or gave emotional support workshops. His most famous quotes were printed and hung on the workshop walls. One in particular became the movement's motto: "I don't pass by." Each time a new member joined, they were given a copy of Julián's notebook, now digitized, so they could experience the original spirit of the network. It was a way to keep him present without turning him into a statue. Camilla, along with other road veterans, took on the responsibility of leading the organization, but they insisted that no one should take Julián's place. "He didn't want thrones, only roads," she repeated. And so the structure remained, horizontal, open, based on trust. Alliances were strengthened with cooperatives, churches, universities, and even some local governments, always under one condition: aid could not be used as propaganda. The network continued to expand, but with its feet firmly on the ground. With each delivery, with each border crossing, Julián's photo was attached to the cabin, not to worship him, but to remind them why they started. Over time, the idea emerged to turn Julián's story into an educational tool. His life was adapted into children's books, community plays, and even a school module on values and citizenship. In several rural schools, children no longer wanted to be astronauts or soccer players, but rather truck drivers of goodwill. In a letter sent from Ecuador, a teacher recounted how one of her students refused to accept school aid if he couldn't repay it with something. Like Julián, he said. That small gesture was replicated in many classrooms. Solidarity swaps, student campaigns, school brigades. Julián had transcended the steering wheel and the asphalt. Now he was rolling in ideas. In her town, an old loading station was renovated and transformed into the Julián Rivas Community Center. It offers classes, organizes fundraising events, screens documentaries, and welcomes passing trucks with hot coffee and words of encouragement. Lourdes attends every week, not as a widow, but as a volunteer. Mayra, now an adult, coordinates programs with other regions. On one of the walls, they painted a huge mural, the old Kenworth W900 advancing between mountains, and in the sky, a serene face guiding the route. Everyone who passes by pauses for a moment, like a silent ritual, before moving on. It's the way they've found to remember and at the same time to continue. Over the years, the Ruta del Bien, Route of Good, consolidated its position as one of the most active solidarity networks in Latin America. Despite lacking large structures or central offices, their response capacity sometimes surpassed that of official organizations. When floods hit Tabasco, they were the first to arrive. When roads were blocked by landslides in Peru, trucks bearing the slogan, "I won't pass by," made their way through the mud. But the most valuable aspect wasn't their speed or logistics, but the way they viewed people, not as numbers or victims, but as brothers and sisters on the journey. That, everyone said, was what Julián had sown. In an interview with a Colombian radio station, Camila was asked how they maintained the original spirit without distorting it over time. Her answer was simple: because it was never a plan, it was a response. She asserted that the movement remained alive, because each new story fueled the next, because Julián didn't leave closed instructions, but rather an open example, and because stopping to help remained, in this fast-paced world, a radical act. She concluded by saying that, as long as there was someone willing to look to the side of the road, Ruta del Bien would continue to exist for a long time. And although her voice broke at the end, no one in the audience doubted that she spoke from the depths of her being. In Brazil, a group of truck drivers, inspired by the documentary, decided to translate the Route of Good materials into Portuguese and adapt them to their local reality. They created a similar network called Caminho da Esperança. Soon, they began coordinating deliveries with the headquarters in Mexico. Julián, although no longer with him, was mentioned at every meeting as O Velho da Estrada, the old man of the highway, a symbol of what can be achieved with determination and a clear direction. Since then, each new member of the Brazilian network receives a postcard with his quote, "If you can stop, you can change." That phrase hung in many truck cabs, right next to the rearview mirror. Meanwhile, in Bolivia, an indigenous community built a small altar with stones and wood at the exact spot where a truck from the Ruta del Bien, Route of Good, had delivered vaccines during an outbreak. In the center of the altar, an image of Julián, smiling, wearing a cap and holding a thermos. They didn't see him as a saint, but rather as a living reminder that humanity can also be miraculous. They called him the driver who brought health, and every year they organized a day of thanksgiving in his name. Thus, unintentionally, Julián became part of many cultures and languages, like an echo that doesn't need volume to reach far. At a university in Chile, a group of mechanical engineering students developed a prototype self-sustaining trailer with solar panels and a water purification system. They named it Julián 1 and donated it to the Ruta del Bien, Route of Good, so it could reach communities without access to basic services. The truck was sent to Oaxaca, where it became part of a mobile medical caravan. Years later, another prototype was created in Argentina, and thus a new division within the movement was born, the Green Trailers. Each one had a different quote from Julián painted on the back, serving as a guide and silent testament to a simple but powerful philosophy. In Mexico, Lourdes continued to visit the workshop on weekends, where talks were now given for new volunteers. She spoke little, but when she did, everyone listened. She shared simple anecdotes, how Julián sipped his coffee, how he jotted down names in his notebook, how he chose to stop even when he was tired. He wasn't perfect, she said. He was afraid, he got angry, he doubted, but he never stopped breaking for anyone. Mayra, now a natural leader, made strategic decisions with other coordinators. And, although the Rivas surname remained a symbol of origin, no one competed for that legacy, because everyone knew that the root of good didn't belong to one family, but to all those who chose to look beyond the windshield. One July afternoon, in a plaza in San Luis Potosí, an international gathering of truckers in solidarity was held. They came from Guatemala, Chile, Uruguay, and even 2 representatives from Canada. The event had no red carpet or speeches from politicians, just a wooden stage, a shared meal, and an open microphone for anyone who wanted to tell their story. Many came up and talked about how a gesture from Julián had changed them, an unexpected stop, a word of encouragement, a ride offered without conditions. At dusk, everyone hugged in a circle, formed a chain of hands around a replica of the Truck of Hope, and observed a minute of silence. Some cried, others looked up at the sky, but everyone felt he was still there. At that same meeting, Mayra presented a new initiative, a microcredit fund to support young people who wanted to become purposeful drivers. It wasn't just about teaching people how to drive, but about developing hearts attentive to the pain of others. The proposal was enthusiastically received, and several organizations offered to contribute. The project was named First Stop, and each scholarship recipient was required as part of their commitment to perform at least 1 year of charitable service on some route. It was a way to keep the original roots alive, the act of stopping. Soon, dozens of young people from different parts of the continent began training under that banner, and all of them, without exception, knew the name Julián Rivas before they ever climbed into the cab for the first time. Meanwhile, on social media, the hashtag Dacha no paso de largo began to be used in contexts Julián would never have imagined. People helping elderly neighbors with their shopping, young people accompanying sick people in hospitals, teachers spending extra hours with students who were falling behind. All of them shared their actions with that phrase as their banner. Far from becoming an empty fad, the digital movement functioned as a mirror. Each story inspired another. An account was even created that compiled testimonies from around the world, with interactive maps showing where a significant stop had been planted. What had once been a crumpled notebook now lived on millions of screens. In one such post, there was a story about a man in Morocco who had translated the phrase into Arabic and painted it on his bicycle. "No God, I can't get over the suffering." He said he'd never met Julián, but when he read about him, something in his life changed. From then on, he carried bottles of water and snacks to distribute to construction workers under the sun. When asked why he did it, he simply replied, "Because someone on another continent stopped for someone like me." That answer went viral, not because it was spectacular, but because it was true, and because it showed that kindness also has wheels and can cross oceans without a passport. With all this accumulated impact, some began to push to canonize Julián, to make him an official figure within some religious institution. But Lourdes and Mayra were clear. Julián didn't want altars, statues, or street names. He wanted movement, not monuments, his granddaughter said in an interview. So, instead of processions or commemorative plaques, they proposed something different, that every year, during the week of his birthday, the Jornada de la Parada, Day of the Parade, would be held, a continental event where thousands of people, regardless of religion or nationality, would carry out an anonymous act of solidarity. They didn't have to say his name, just stop, help, and continue. The first edition was more powerful than they imagined. From rural communities to large cities, people took to the streets with thermoses of coffee, first aid, kits, tools, and above all, willingness. There were no selfies or hashtags on social media, just an image repeated thousands of times, an outstretched hand. That was the true canonization of Julián. Not an unattainable figure, but a living legacy that anyone could follow. That day, Lourdes looked out the workshop window, saw 2 trucks go by with the phrase, "No paso de largo," "I'm not passing by," and smiled. "There goes your legacy, old man," she murmured. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel absence. She felt company. If you've made it this far, maybe this channel will be a stop along your way too. Subscribe and share. Years later, a journalist wrote a book titled The Trailer of Hope, the story of Julián Rivas and the root of good. The book not only recounted the chronology of events, but also collected testimonies from people transformed by it, from an ex-convict in Jalisco to a volunteer nurse in Paraguay. It was translated into 5 languages and became required reading at some social work universities. But what moved Lourdes and Mayra most wasn't the book's prestige, but a letter they received from a young man in prison. "This book taught me that stopping for someone can redeem a life. I'm going to get out of here and be a truck of hope." These kinds of messages were the true fuel that kept the network alive, and although the structure had grown, with new centers, programs, and routes, it remained faithful to its core. The daily decision not to be indifferent. Mayra, now over 30, traveled the continent sharing the root of good model, but in each talk, she made it clear, this wasn't born from a master plan, it was born from an accident, from a second chance, and from a man who chose not to give up. She said this with a firm voice, similar to her grandfather's, and with a gaze that revealed that even though he was gone, his spirit continued to stop at every crossroads. A recent initiative was the creation of the Museum of the Living Road, an interactive space located on the very spot where Julián suffered the accident. There, visitors can climb aboard an exact replica of the Esperanza truck, listen to recordings of its routes, read letters of gratitude, and learn stories that arose from its decision to stop. But the most striking aspect of the museum isn't in the display cases, but in a special room where people can write to someone they didn't pass by that day, a parent, a neighbor, a stranger. The walls are covered with thousands of names and short stories that prove that compassion is contagious. Camilla, who now runs an educational foundation focused on solidarity transportation, says Julián's greatest legacy was showing that logistics can also have a soul. In her training sessions, she repeats what he told her the first time they shared a cabin. Driving is knowing how to arrive, but stopping at the right moment, that's knowing how to live. That phrase has been etched in hundreds of notebooks, sketchbooks, tattoos, and even songs. And although the foundation works with advanced technology, route planning, and monitoring systems, everyone knows that the essential element remains human, because at the end of the day, every route begins with a simple question: am I going to stop or am I going to keep going? At a conference in Quito, Mayra was invited to close the event with a reflection. She took the stage with a notebook identical to the one her grandfather used, took a deep breath, and said, "My grandfather didn't change the world with a speech. He changed it with one stop, just one. Many more followed, but it all began when he chose to stop instead of continue." The entire audience stood. Some cried, others applauded. But what was most striking was what happened next. Dozens of people left the venue and headed to a nearby neighborhood to deliver food, toys, and blankets. They hadn't planned it. They just felt they couldn't leave without doing something. That's how strong the Ruta del Bien, root of good, continued to beat. Over the years, Julián's story has also been addressed by artists. Murals were created in Medellin, songs in Buenos Aires, and plays in Mexico City, each with its own interpretation, but all with the same message: that stopping is not weakness, but courage; that helping is not charity, but justice; that the true path is not always found on the GPS, but in the heart. Lourdes, already elderly, attended many of these events in silence, holding a thermos of coffee in her hands. And every time someone approached her to thank her for Julián's legacy, she responded the same way: "Thank you for following him. He only showed us the first detour." One day, an 8-year-old boy named Gael was interviewed at a rural school where the Ruta del Bien week was being celebrated. They asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and without hesitation he replied, "I want to be like Don Julián, drive a truck full of good things and stop when someone needs help." His answer went viral, but beyond the likes, what really mattered was that it inspired a spontaneous collection in his community. In less than a week, neighbors filled a truck with donations, and Gael, wearing his red cap and carrying a sign that read "No paso de largo," led the caravan. Thus, the cycle continued, multiplying without plan or permission. That same year, a small traffic sign was placed at the exact kilometer where Julián had his accident. It's not a monument or a statue, just a yellow sign that reads, "A new route began here." Many truck drivers passing by honk their horns in a sign of respect. Some leave flowers, others stop for a few minutes to gaze at the horizon, not out of nostalgia, but to remember that sometimes the true journey begins where we thought it had all ended. And that sign, simple and firm, is a silent witness that a single act of humanity can open paths that no map dared to trace. At the gas stations of northern Mexico, where once only talk of loads, times, and tolls was shared, it's now common to hear stories of that trucker who changed the course. Young drivers repeat anecdotes as if they were legends, and the more experienced ones recount them with respect, as if Julián could still appear around any curve. Some claim to have seen him in their dreams. Others say they feel him when they stop for no reason and find someone who needed help. No one says for sure, but they all agree on the same thing: Julián didn't leave. He just changed seats. Today, every time a truck with the slogan "No paso de largo" crosses a border, it's not just a logistical act. It's a declaration of principles. It's a flag without nationality, an engine fired by compassion. The root of good is no longer a project. It's a way of looking at the world. And although many have never met Julián in person, everyone knows who he was, because his footprints aren't in a museum or on an avenue bearing his name. They're in every story of someone who, by choosing to stop, changed a destiny. Like him, like so many who came after, like so many who will come. In the heart of the Ruta del Bien headquarters, next to the tools, maps, and backpacks ready to go, is a wooden box engraved with Julián's name. Inside are his original notebook, the wooden cross that always hung around his neck, and an old photo of the old bull, the Kenworth W900 that marked the beginning of it all. It's not open to the public, but each new volunteer is invited to view it once, in silence, not to worship, but to remember that everything that exists today began with a broken man, an unexpected phrase, and the decision to return to the path out of love for others. And so, with every day, every delivery, every unexpected stop at the edge of the asphalt, Julián remains present, not as a ghost, but as a living compass. The route of good has no final destination, because its mission is not to arrive, but to stop. And as long as there is someone willing to look to the side, to slow down out of compassion, to offer a hand instead of honking the horn, that route will remain alive. Because Julián Rivas didn't just transport merchandise. He carried something that no GPS can calculate and no truck can fully contain: hope. He ended his life as he lived, on the road, with his eyes straight ahead and his soul full. And he left one last word written in the notebook, now framed on his desk: continue, That's what they did. That's what they're doing. That's what they'll do. This channel can only continue if you stop for a moment and subscribe. Thanks for being here.